On March 7, 1985, Colonel of State Security Viktor Semyonovich Karelin stood by the window of office number 13 on the third floor of the building on Lubyanskaya Square. Outside, snow was falling slowly, covering Moscow in a white shroud. In his hands, the colonel held a yellowed folder marked Top Secret, Special Importance. 32 years of service. 1,847 interrogations. And only now, when the country was on the threshold of change, when the unfamiliar word glasnost was increasingly heard in the corridors of power, did Karelin realize the terrible truth. The method he had used all these years was not created to seek the truth. It was created to destroy it. The folder contained 3 sheets, each with one question. Simple words, ordinary phrases. But it was these 3 questions that had broken more lives than all the tortures of the medieval Inquisition. The colonel knew that in a few hours, a man who would change the history of the country would enter this office. And depending on which of the 3 questions was asked first, not only his fate, but the fate of the entire Soviet Union would be decided. The door creaked quietly. At the threshold appeared Major Stepanov, the very one who had discovered this method 32 years ago. Viktor Semyonovich, the major's voice trembled. The subject has arrived, but there's a problem. He knows about the 3 questions. Karelin turned slowly. In his eyes was the weariness of a man who knew too much about the nature of truth. How? A cipher from Washington. The Americans are ready to exchange him for our resident, but there are conditions. No special methods of influence. The colonel smirked. Special methods. If only they knew that the most terrible method leaves no marks on the body. It leaves marks on the soul. Bring him in. Karelin sat down at the massive oak desk. And Major, bring the tape recorder.
History must hear this conversation. When the door closed behind Stepanov, the colonel opened the bottom drawer of the desk and took out a pistol. He checked the magazine, put it on safety, and placed it next to the folder. He knew that after today's interrogation, one of the 3 of them would not leave this office alive. The history of the method began long before the revolution, in the depths of the Tsarist secret police. In 1897, the head of the St. Petersburg Security Department, Sergei Vasilyevich Zubetov, made a revolutionary discovery. A person lies not with words, he lies with his body. Intonation, pauses between words. Zubetov was the first to keep detailed protocols not only of what the arrested said, but of how they said it. After the October Revolution, the secret police archives fell into the hands of the Cheka. Felix Edmundovich Dzerzhinsky, Iron Felix, a man with cold eyes and the hot heart of a revolutionary, spent hours studying these protocols. One detail struck him. Experienced revolutionaries who had endured the Tsarist torture chambers broke not from physical pressure, but from unexpected questions about their past. In 1921, Dzerzhinsky created a secret laboratory at the Institute of Experimental Psychology. It was headed by Professor Alexander Romanovich Luria, a brilliant psychologist and student of Vygotsky himself. Luria received unlimited access to interrogation materials and a blank check for any research. For 3 years, the laboratory operated in the strictest secrecy. Luria and his team analyzed thousands of protocols, searched for patterns, and built psychological models. They studied the mechanisms of memory, the peculiarities of perception in stressful situations, and ways to suppress volitional control. But the main discovery was made completely by accident.
In February 1924, a young investigator from Sverdlovsk, Nikolai Stepanov, was interrogating a former Kolchak officer in a case of a counter-revolutionary conspiracy.
Stepanov was inexperienced and flustered, and instead of the standard questions from the manual, he suddenly asked the arrested man about his childhood. The effect was stunning. The officer, who had held firm for 3 weeks already, suddenly burst into tears and began to talk. The protocol of this interrogation reached Luria. The professor immediately summoned Stepanov to Moscow. What the young investigator told him forced the scientist to reconsider all his theories about the nature of the human psyche. Stepanov did not just ask questions about childhood. He structured them in a special sequence, creating a psychological resonance that destroyed the protective mechanisms of consciousness. Luria and Stepanov worked together for the next 6 months. By the fall of 1924, the method was ready. 3 questions, refined to every word, to every intonation. The first test was conducted on volunteers from the OGPU school cadets. The results exceeded all expectations. Even trained agents who knew about the upcoming experiment could not resist the method. In December, Luria presented the results personally to Dzerzhinsky. Iron Felix, a man who had seen everything, was shocked. "Alexander Romanovich," he said after a long pause, "you have created a weapon more terrible than a bullet. A bullet kills the body. Your method kills the soul," Luria objected. Dzerzhinsky shook his head. "Truth can be different, Professor. There is the truth of fact, and there is the truth of the soul. Your method drags out such depths of the human self that the person himself would prefer not to know about." Despite his doubts, Dzerzhinsky approved the implementation of the method, but with one condition. It should be applied only by specially trained researchers who had passed psychological selection. The risk was too great that an unprepared person would not cope with the truth that it would reveal. By the spring of 1925, the first group of psychological investigators was created. 12 people, each with a higher education, each having undergone 6 months of training under Luria himself. It was they who became the core of the new OGPU subdivision, the Special Department of Psychological Methods of Influence. But fate decreed otherwise. In July 1926, Dzerzhinsky died. With his death, the method fell into the hands of people for whom truth was not the goal, but a means of power, a means of intimidation, a means of destruction. Professor Luria, realizing what his creation was turning into, tried to destroy all the materials. But it was too late. The method had taken on a life of its own. And Luria himself officially died of a heart attack in 1937. But Stepanov, the only one from the first group to live into the 80s, knew the truth. On the night of his arrest, the professor managed to burn not all the documents. He hid one copy, and, before his death, managed to pass 4 words to Stepanov. The 4th question exists. What this meant, Stepanov understood only 29 years later, when Nikayev's personal file on engineer Krylov fell into his hands. March 1953 turned out to be unusually cold in Moscow. On March 5th, Stalin died, and it seemed that nature itself was mourning the leader of the peoples with icy tears. But in the depths of the Lubyanka, life continued its course. It was in those days that a man who changed the history of Soviet criminology was brought into the office of Major Nikolai Stepanov. Engineer Pavel Andreevich Krylov had been arrested on a denunciation, a standard case of sabotage at Defense Plant No. 112. They suspected sabotage in the Design Bureau, where a new guidance system for anti-aircraft complexes was being developed. The evidence was circumstantial, the witnesses unreliable, but in those times, that was enough. Krylov was 43 years old. Thin, with premature gray at his temples, he gave the impression of a man immersed in his own thoughts. On the very first interrogation, Stepanov realized that he had an unusual prisoner before him. Pavel Andreevich, the major began standardly, tell me about your work in the KB. Krylov raised his eyes. His gaze was clear, direct, without a shadow of fear. I was developing a mathematical model for target anticipation for the S-75 system. The main problem was accounting for atmospheric distortions at high altitudes. I proposed using third-order differential equations with variable coefficients. The next 2 hours, Krylov gave a lecture on higher mathematics. Stepanov, who had an engineering education, struggled to follow the train of thought. But the matter was not in the complexity of the material. What struck him was something else. Krylov spoke absolutely calmly, as if he were not in the office of an NKVD investigator, but at a scientific conference. The next 3 days followed the same pattern. Krylov answered all questions in extreme detail, with mathematical derivations, drawings, formulas. He did not deny the accusations, but neither did he admit them. He simply presented the facts with the precision of a logarithmic slide rule. On the 4th day, Stepanov realized that standard methods were not working. Krylov was not afraid. Not in the sense that he was brave, he simply did not perceive the situation as threatening. For him, the interrogation was a logical problem that needed to be solved. Stepanov requested the personal file. What he read explained a lot. Krylov had differed in developmental features since childhood. Brilliant mathematical abilities were combined with a complete inability to socially adapt. In the university characteristics, it was noted, a brilliant mind, but absolutely does not understand human emotions. Incapable of lying, not for moral reasons, but due to the organic inability of the brain to construct alternative realities. And then it dawned on Stepanov. If Krylov cannot lie, then the problem is not to make him tell the truth.
The problem is to make him realize which truth the investigation needs. On the morning of March 7th, 2 days after Stalin's death, Stepanov entered Krylov's cell with a new strategy. He did not ask about sabotage. Instead, the major asked a question he had not asked in almost 30 years. Pavel Andreevich, tell me about your childhood. About that day when you first realized you were different from other children. The effect was instantaneous. Krylov shuddered, his eyes widened, his hands trembled. For the first time since his arrest, emotions appeared on the engineer's face. I was 7 years old. Krylov's voice became quiet, almost a whisper. September 3rd, 1917. We lived in Tsarskoye Selo. My father was a mathematics teacher at the gymnasium. That day, the neighbor boy, Kolya Serdeyev, said he had seen our cat give birth to kittens in the shed. All the children ran to look, but I stood there and didn't understand why run. I knew for sure that the cat couldn't have given birth to kittens because it was a tomcat. I'd seen that when I studied anatomy. But everyone ran and came back disappointed. There were no kittens, and Kolya was laughing. It was a joke, a lie for entertainment. That whole night I couldn't sleep, trying to understand the logic. Why say what isn't there? What function does it serve? Stepanov was silent. He felt something important was happening. Krylov continued. Father tried to explain, talked about imagination, about play, about social rituals, but I didn't understand. For me, the world was a system of equations. Every action, a function. Every result, a derivative. A lie violated all the laws. It was irrational. And what happened next? Stepanov asked quietly. Next, I learned to imitate, observed others, derived patterns of behavior, built algorithms of reactions. By 14, I could predict a person's behavior with 87% accuracy.
But to understand, to truly understand, I never could why people say one thing, think another, and do a third. Stepanov took out the folder with the case materials. Pavel Andreevich, the file contains testimony from your colleague Mikhailov. He claims you deliberately introduced an error in the calculations. Is that true? Krylov nodded. Yes, I introduced an error. Stepanov tensed. A confession? But unintentionally, Krylov continued. Mikhailov is misinterpreting the facts. On February 14th, I did change the coefficient in the equation. But it wasn't an error. It was a correction. I discovered that at negative 40 degrees Celsius, which is possible at 12,000 meters altitude, the metal of the guides changes its properties. If I hadn't made the change, the system would have failed. But explaining this to Mikhailov, he's not a mathematician. For him, any deviation from approved parameters is sabotage.
Why didn't you report the changes? I did. I submitted a report to the KB chief, Colonel Zubov, on February 14th at 1623. Document registration number 843D/secret. Stepanov made a note. That's easy to check. Pavel Andreevich, and what do you think about Mikhailov? Krylov pondered. Mikhailov is a function with multiple variables. The main constant is fear. He fears making a mistake, fears responsibility, fears superiors. Fear distorts his perception. He sees threats where there are none and misses real problems. The probability that he wrote the denunciation out of fear, not malicious intent, is 92%. Stepanov set the folder aside. 17 minutes of conversation and the picture of the case turned upside down. But the main discovery was still ahead. The next question the major asked intuitively, without thinking about the consequences. Pavel Andreevich, if you could change one event in your life, what would it be? Krylov froze. An expression appeared on his face that Stepanov had never seen. A mixture of pain, fear, and some childish helplessness.
June 23rd, 1941. The engineer's voice trembled. I should have calculated it. All the data was there. Troop concentrations on the border, logistical flows, changes in radio communications. I saw the pattern, but didn't draw conclusions. If I had warned, my father was in the Brest fortress, teaching at the military school. He died on the first day of the war, and I could have warned. The probability was 84%. Tears streamed down Krylov's face. The man incapable of lying was also unable to hide his pain. You are not to blame, Stepanov said quietly. No one could have predicted it. I could, Krylov cried out. Numbers don't lie. I saw all the signs but didn't want to see the conclusion, because the conclusion was irrational. Germany's attack made no logical sense. A war on two fronts is mathematical suicide. But Hitler was irrational, and I didn't account for the coefficient of madness, and father died because of my blindness. Silence hung in the office. Stepanov realized he had just witnessed something incredible. Krylov, the man without emotions, had just experienced catharsis. And this catharsis opened the door to the truth that the engineer had hidden even from himself. The next 3 hours, Krylov spoke about the plant, the KB, about the system of padding and false reports that permeated the entire defense industry, about how bosses demanded the impossible and subordinates reported fulfillment, about how drawings were adjusted to prepared parts, not parts made to drawings. But most importantly, Krylov named names, not out of a desire for revenge or to save himself. He simply stated the facts as he saw them, and he saw what others didn't. The mathematics of corruption, the formula of fear, the algorithm of lies. By evening, Stepanov had material not for one sabotage case, but for an entire system. And all this, thanks to 3 questions asked in the correct sequence. Leaving the cell, the major headed straight to the leadership.
In the reception room, Colonel Karelin was waiting for him, a young, ambitious employee of the special department. Well, Stepanov, did you crack the physicist? Asked Karelin with a grin. He is not a physicist, but a mathematician, and he did not crack. He simply doesn't know how to lie. Everyone knows how to lie, Major. The question is the right motivation. Stepanov shook his head. You didn't understand, Comrade Colonel. Krylov is organically incapable of lying. His brain works differently. And that's why Stepanov fell silent. What he had realized in Krylov's cell was too important to share with Karelin. What exactly why? The colonel frowned. That's why he sees the truth where others see only lies. Krylov is a microscope, Comrade Colonel, and we were trying to hammer nails with it. Karelin didn't understand the metaphor, but didn't argue. And he should have, because it was on that very day, March 7th, 1953, that a new version of the 3 questions method was born. A version that 30 years later would bring both Stepanov and Karelin to that very office, number 13. But Krylov didn't tell everything. He hid one detail even from himself. In his calculations, there was one more formula. A formula predicting the collapse of the system. And according to this formula,
Exactly 38 years remained until the catastrophe. Psychologists call it regression. The psyche's return to earlier forms of response. But NKVD investigators and later KGB called it simpler: opening the soul. The first question from the legendary triad was developed by Professor Luria, based on the study of thousands of protocols. It sounded different for different people, but the essence remained unchanged: to return the person to that moment in childhood when they first faced the choice between truth and lies. January 1961. Leningrad. In the mansion on Litany Prospect, where the KGB Directorate for Leningrad and the region was located, preparations were underway for an unusual interrogation.
The detainee, William Fisher, officially a translator at the Canadian Consulate, unofficially a career officer of the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States. Fisher had been caught red-handed. Microfilms, a cipher notebook, even a pistol with a silencer were found on him. There was enough evidence for execution, but Moscow demanded more. The entire network was needed: dead drops, couriers, residents. Fisher remained silent. For 3 weeks, the best investigators from the Leningrad Directorate tried to make him talk, to no avail. Fisher was a top-class professional, a graduate of the camp school, trained in counter-interrogation techniques. He knew all methods of psychological pressure and had an antidote for each. On January 23rd, Colonel Karelin arrived in Leningrad. By that time, he had been heading the Special Department of Psychological Methods of Influence for 7 years. In the colonel's briefcase lay a thin folder with 3 sheets. The first one contained the question that would change everything. The interrogation began at 10 a.m. Karelin entered the cell alone, without guards. Fisher sat on an iron bunk. A large man of about 45, with an intelligent face and calm grey eyes. "Mr. Fisher," Karelin began in English. "Or do you prefer William? It doesn't matter to me." Fisher spoke in Russian, almost without an accent. "Fine, William. I won't ask about your work, about the ciphers, about the contacts. We'll learn all that later. Right now, I'm interested in something else." Karelin sat down opposite, took out cigarettes, lit one. He offered one to Fisher, who refused. "Tell me about Lake Ontario," the colonel said unexpectedly. "That summer day when you were 11 years old." Fisher jerked, as if struck by an electric shock. Fear flashed in his eyes. The first emotion in 3 weeks. "Where did you get that from?" He cut himself off. "July 7, 1927, Karelin continued calmly. "Sunday. Your father took you fishing." Just you, without your older brother. You were happy. Your father rarely spent time just with you. Remember what the weather was like? Fisher was silent, but his hands trembled treacherously. "Sunny," the colonel continued. "The lake was calm, like a mirror. You caught your first trout in your life. Your father praised you. And then something happened that changed your entire life. Tell me about it." "I don't understand what you're talking about." Fisher's voice sounded dull. "About the choice, William. About that choice that an 11-year-old boy made for you between the truth to your father and loyalty to your friend. Remember Jimmy O'Brien?" Fisher covered his face with his hands. Karelin knew the first question had worked. All that remained was to wait. "Jimmy was my best friend." The American's voice sounded as if he were 11 again. "A red-haired Irishman, son of a mechanic. My father didn't approve of our friendship, or that circle, but I didn't care. Jimmy was real, not like the boys from our school." "What happened at the lake?" "We had agreed to meet there with Jimmy. He had a plan to steal old McPherson's boat and sail to the island where, according to rumors, there was treasure. A childish fantasy, but we believed it. I was supposed to distract my father while Jimmy prepared the boat." Fisher fell silent, immersed in memories. "But my father saw everything," Karelin prompted. "Yes. He saw Jimmy untying the boat, asked me if I knew that boy, and I said I didn't. My father called the police. They arrested Jimmy. His father lost his job because of the scandal. They left the city. I never saw him again." "Why did you lie to your friend?" "I was afraid of my father. He was strict, demanding. I knew if I confessed he would punish me, deprive me of everything I loved.
But most importantly, he would be disappointed in me. And I wanted so badly for him to be proud of me. And what happened next? My father learned the truth a week later. A neighbor had seen Jimmy with me. My father didn't shout, didn't punish. He just said, "William, you betrayed your friend out of cowardice. That's the worst thing a man can do. Now live with it." Fisher raised his eyes to Karelin. There were tears in them, and I have. For 45 years I've lived with it. Every day I remembered Jimmy's face when the policeman put handcuffs on him. He looked at me and didn't understand. Until the last moment, he waited for me to tell the truth. "That's why you became a spy?" Karelin asked quietly. "Yes, so that I would never betray again. So that I would be loyal to the end, even if it costs my life." "But you are betraying again, William. Betraying people who trust you." Fisher shuddered. "That's different. It's work. War. No, William, it's the same choice between fear and loyalty. And you're choosing fear again. Fear of death. Fear of pain. Fear of the unknown. Just like back then at the lake." "I won't betray anyone," the American cried out. "You have already betrayed yourself. That 11-year-old boy who swore to be loyal. Tell me, William, what would that boy do in your place?" Fisher was silent for a long time, then quietly said, "He would tell the truth. The whole truth. Because a lie is betrayal, and betrayal is the death of the soul. Then tell the truth, William, not to me, to that boy. He has been waiting for 45 years. And Fisher began to speak. For the next 8 hours he told everything. Names, dead drops, codes, plans, operations. Not out of fear, not out of betrayal, but out of a strange, perverted loyalty to himself, to that boy from Lake Ontario who could never forgive himself his first lie. By evening, Karelin had information that allowed him to dismantle the entire American residency in Leningrad. But there was no joy.
The colonel understood that he had just destroyed a man. Not physically, psychologically. Fisher would never be the same again. "What will happen to me?" the American asked when it was all over. "Omen, in a year, maybe 2, you'll go home." "There is no home anymore. I betrayed them all." "You told the truth." "Sometimes the truth is betrayal." Colonel Karelin did not answer. He knew the American was right. The first question of the method was a perfect weapon precisely because it turned a person's main strength, conscience, against him. 2 years later, Fisher was indeed exchanged. He returned to the States, but a month later shot himself. In his suicide note, there were only 3 words: "Forgive me, Jimmy." And a new folder appeared in Karelin's office. It no longer contained 3 questions, but 4. The 4th one the colonel wrote himself after Fisher's interrogation, but he did not dare to use it. The power of this question was too terrifying. 9 more years passed before the second question from the triad revealed its dark power, and the victim was not a foreign spy, but one of our own, Soviet man. The second question was built on a paradox discovered by ancient Greek philosophers. A person faced with a choice between 2 equally unacceptable options destroys their own psychological defenses while trying to find a third way. But there is no third way. And at the moment of realizing this fact, the consciousness becomes defenseless against external influence. October 1972. Moscow was bathed in the gold of autumn leaves, while in the basements of the Lubyanka, a trial was being prepared that was destined to become a turning point in the history of the 3 questions method. Andrei Dmitrievich Sakharov, a name known to the whole world.
Physicist, academician, 3-time hero of socialist labor, creator of the hydrogen bomb, and now a dissident, human rights activist, author of appeals to the Western press, a man who became a symbol of free thinking in the Soviet Union. But it was not Sakharov sitting in the cell. They were afraid to touch him. Too loud a name. Too much international attention. In the cell sat Mikhail Petrovich Yakunin,
a historian, Sakharov's friend, one of the organizers of an underground seminar on human rights. 48 years old, professor at NSU, author of dozens of scientific works on Russian history. Karelin personally handled Yakunin's case. By that time, he was already a KGB major general. The task was delicate, not just to obtain a confession, but to force Yakunin to publicly renounce his views and condemn Sakharov and other dissidents. Standard methods were not suitable. Any traces of physical impact would cause an international scandal. Karelin prepared for 3 weeks, studied Yakunin's biography, read his scientific works, analyzed the psychological portrait. The historian was a principled man with a rigid system of moral coordinates. Breaking him with the first question, returning to childhood, wouldn't work. Yakunin was not ashamed of his past. The second question remained, the paradox of choice. But what choice to offer to a man ready to die for his beliefs? The answer came unexpectedly. In Yakunin's personal file, Karelin found a mention of his daughter Elena, 23 years old, a graduate student at the philological faculty, talented, promising, and completely uninvolved in her father's activities. On October 29, Karelin entered Yakunin's cell. The historian was sitting at the table, reading a volume of Klyuchevsky, the only book he was allowed to take with him. "Mikhail Petrovich," the general began, "I want to offer you a choice." "I won't sign anything," Yakunin cut him off. "I'm not asking you to sign, just to choose."
You see, we have 2 options for the development of your case. First, you continue to remain silent, refuse to cooperate. Then, we file the case under Article 70, Anti-Soviet Agitation and Propaganda, 5 years in camps, confiscation of property, deprivation of rights. Your name will be erased from history, works withdrawn from libraries. Students will forget they had such a professor. I'm ready for that. I know, but there is a second option. We close your case due to insufficient evidence. You are released, return to the university, continue your scientific work. The only condition is to cease contacts with Sakharov and his circle. Yakunin smirked. And you think I'll agree? Betray my friends for personal freedom? No, Mikhail Petrovich, I think you'll refuse. Therefore, I'll add one detail. If you choose the first option, the prison accusation, we will be forced to check everyone connected to you, including your daughter. Yakunin paled. Lena has nothing to do with it. I know, but a check is a check. A commission at the university, questions about loyalty, doubts about reliability. You understand how it works. Daughter of an enemy of the people. Even if we find nothing, the stigma remains. Graduate school, dissertation defense, scientific career, all in question. This is blackmail. This is a choice, Mikhail Petrovich, your principles or your daughter's future. What is more important, your truth or her life? Yakunin was silent. Karelin saw how his brain was working, how he was looking for a way out of the trap. And if I choose the second option, renounce my friends, then Elena will continue her studies, defend her dissertation, become a professor. She has brilliant abilities. She'll go far, if, of course, her father doesn't get in the way. You demand the impossible. How can I look Andrei Dmitrievich in the eye? And how will you look your daughter in the eye when, because of your stubbornness, her life is ruined? Yakunin stood up, paced the cell. Karelin waited. He knew that right now, in the historian's head, that very struggle predicted by Luria was taking place. The struggle between duty and love, between principles and humanity. I have a third option, Yakunin finally said. I will commit suicide. Then the case will be closed and Lena won't suffer. Suicide in a KGB cell. Karelin shook his head. That's even worse. Daughter of a suicide who couldn't withstand the interrogations. Eternal suspicion. What did he hide? What was so terrible that he knew that he preferred death? No, Mikhail Petrovich, that's not a way out. Then what do you want from me specifically? One public statement that you were misled, that you realized the erroneousness of your views, that you urge others to think.
No names, no details, just an admission of error. This is betrayal. This is compromise. You step back a little so that your daughter can move forward. Isn't a father's duty higher than political ambitions? This is not ambitions. This is convictions. Convictions for which an innocent girl must pay. Yakunin sat back down at the table, dropped his head into his hands. Karelin knew the second question had worked. The paradox of choice was destroying the historian's psyche from within. "Give me time to think," Yakunin croaked. "Until morning. Tomorrow at 10, I expect an answer." Karelin left the cell. In the corridor, Stepanov was waiting for him, now also a general. "Well, how?" the old comrade asked. "He'll break by morning. He'll break. The second question always works. And if he chooses prison, he won't. I saw his eyes when I spoke about his daughter. Fatherly love is stronger than any principles. This is cruel, Victor. This is effective. And no traces, no violence. The person makes the choice himself. A choice without choice."
Any choice is an illusion. Nikolai, we always choose between bad and worse. The only question is what we consider worse. In the morning, Yakunin signed the statement. Short, without details, but sufficient for publication in Pravda. A week later, the historian was released. He returned to the university, but never lectured again. A year later, he retired due to health reasons. Elena Yakumina defended her dissertation, became a professor, head of the department. She never learned about the choice her father made. Mikhail Petrovich took that secret to his grave in 1980, and after this case, Karelin never used the second question again. In his report to the superiors, he wrote, "The method is effective, but has a side effect. Complete destruction of the object's personality. Recommend using only in exceptional cases." But there was still the third question, the most terrible of all. The question after which a person not only broke, but ceased to be himself. In the secret archives of the Lubyanka, the third question began under the codename Operation Mirror. Its essence was simple and terrifying at the same time: to force a person to see themselves from the outside, to realize the complete insignificance of their existence, to understand that their entire life has been a lie. Professor Luria, while developing this question, warned, the application of the third level of influence may lead to irreversible changes in the psyche. It is recommended to use only in cases of state importance, and only by specially trained operators. June 1979. The case of embezzlements in the USSR Ministry of Fisheries had snowballed. Black caviar, red fish, currency operations. The scale of the theft was staggering. But the main figure in the case remained untouchable. Grigory Pavlovich Medvedev, deputy minister, a man with an impeccable biography, hero of socialist labor, deputy of the Supreme Soviet, member of the Central Committee.
There were no direct charges against him, only indirect testimonies, hints, suspicions. Medvedev had been interrogated for 2 months. The best investigators from the KGB, prosecutor's office, Ministry of Internal Affairs. To no avail. The deputy minister maintained astonishing composure. To all accusations, he replied with one thing: prove it. And they couldn't prove it. Medvedev was cautious. He never took anything himself, only through a long chain of intermediaries. He never signed dubious documents. He never met with those who could compromise him. At the beginning of August, the case was handed over to Karelin. By that time, the general had not conducted interrogations personally for 5 years. He led the department, trained personnel, developed methods. But Medvedev's case was special. From above, they hinted, if the deputy minister doesn't crack, the entire KGB will come under fire. Karelin studied the case materials for a week. Medvedev was a tough nut to crack. The first question wouldn't work. He had no childhood traumas. A happy family, loving parents,
academic successes. The second question was also useless. Medvedev was a cynic. He had no moral dilemmas. The third question remained, but Karelin didn't want to use it. In the entire history of the method, the third question had been used only 4 times. 2 people committed suicide, 1 went insane. The fourth became a different person, lost memory of his past life. But there was no choice. On August 15, Karelin entered Medvedev's cell. The deputy minister looked splendid, well-rested, calm, even cheerful. "Ah, General Karelin," he exclaimed. "I've heard of you, master of psychological interrogations. Decided to try your tricks on me?" "No tricks, Grigory Pavlovich, just a conversation." "A conversation? Excellent. What shall we talk about? The weather? Politics? About how I'm supposedly plundering the people's wealth?" Karelin sat down opposite, looked intently at Medvedev.
Grigory Pavlovich, have you ever wondered why you live? Medvedev laughed. No, that's a turn. Philosophy in the Lubyanka. Why do I live? Like everyone else, I work for the good of the homeland. Build communism. No, Karelin interrupted. I'm asking seriously. You, personally you, Grigory Pavlovich Medvedev. Why do you live? What will remain after you? Deeds will remain. Factories that I built, people I helped. Factories were built by others. Workers, engineers, architects. You only signed papers. People were helped by others too. Doctors, teachers, neighbors. You only distributed what others created. So what will remain specifically from you? Medvedev frowned. What are you getting at? To a simple question. Imagine that tomorrow you die. Heart attack, stroke, accident, doesn't matter. You just die. Who will cry at your funeral? Family? Friends? Colleagues? Family? Karelin took out a folder. Your wife filed for divorce 3 months ago. You convinced her to wait until the end of the case. She agreed only out of fear for her own position. Daughter, here's her letter, intercepted by our service. Quote, "Father died for me a long time ago. He was never a father. Only a function, a position, a portrait in the newspaper. Son left for Novosibirsk 5 years ago. Hasn't visited once. Hasn't called. Who else? Friends. Name at least one person you can call a friend." Medvedev was silent. You can't, because you have no friends. There are subordinates who fear you. There are superiors for whom you are useful. There are accomplices with whom you are bound by mutual guarantee, but no friends. Colleagues, here are the protocols of surveys of your colleagues in the ministry. Do you know what they say about you? Slippery type. Careerist. Ready to sell his own mother for a position. These are people you've worked with for 20 years. This is all fabricated. You deliberately? Fine. Let's conduct a thought experiment. You've been sitting in this cell for 2 months already. Who has tried to help you during this time? Who wrote a letter in your support? Who even inquired about your fate? Medvedev was silent. Karelin knew the answer. No one. Grigory Pavlovich, you have lived 58 years, more than half a century. And in these years, you haven't created a single real connection with another person. You were a function in the state machine, a cog that can be replaced, and you have been replaced. There's already a new deputy in the ministry, young, energetic. They say he works better than you. That's not true. That's a fact. But the matter is not in that. The matter is in another question. So you stole, we both know that, 1 million rubles. Why? What did you buy with them? Happiness, love, respect? You have 3 dachas, you don't live in them. 5 cars, you drive an official one. Accounts in Swiss banks, you can't use them. So why? I don't admit it. Grigory Pavlovich, Karelin leaned closer. Right now, you are sitting in a cell in the Lubyanka. A trial, sentence, prison await you. In the best case, 10 years. In the worst, execution. And do you know what the most terrible thing is? No one will wait for you. No one will count the days until your return. You will disappear and the world won't notice, as if you never existed. Medvedev paled. His hands trembled. But most importantly, Grigory Pavlovich, you know this yourself. Always knew. That's why you stole.
Tried to fill the emptiness inside with something. That's why you made a career, hoped that the position would replace the personality, but it didn't. And here you are, and for the first time in your life, you are forced to look the truth in the eyes. You are no one, an empty space, a function without content. Enough, Medvedev jumped up. You have no right. I have the right to ask you one last question, the most important one.
Grigory Pavlovich, if you admit that your life was a mistake, that you wasted 58 years in vain, that you betrayed everyone, and yourself first and foremost, if you admit this, you have a chance in the remaining years to become a person, a real person, and not a function. But for that, you need to tell the truth, the whole truth, about yourself, first and foremost. Medvedev stood swaying. His face was gray, his eyes empty. I don't know who I am, he whispered. I haven't known for a long time. I wake up in the morning and don't understand why I get up. I go to work and don't understand why I work. I return home and don't understand why I return. I died long ago, General, about 20 years ago. My body just kept functioning. Tell me about the embezzlements. And what's the difference? Did I steal or not? What will it change? I'm nobody anyway. It will change one thing. You will stop lying, at least to yourself. And Medvedev told everything. Schemes, names, amounts, accounts. He spoke monotonously, indifferently, as if it were about someone else. When he finished, he looked at Karelin with empty eyes. Now, are you satisfied? Got what you wanted. I got the truth. Truth? And do you know what the truth is, General? We are all nobody. You, I, all these important people in high offices. We are functions, cogs, lines in protocols. And when we die, other functions will replace us, and nothing will change. That's the truth. Medvedev sat back down on the bunk, dropped his head into his hands. You can go. I've told everything. Karelin left the cell. In the corridor, Colonel Zaitsev, a young, promising employee, was waiting for him. Comrade General, will he sign the protocol? He will sign. He'll sign anything. It doesn't matter to him anymore. Excellent work. The third question works miracles. Karelin stopped, looked at the colonel's enthusiastic face.
Zaitsev, do you know what happened to Medvedev after the interrogation? He confessed to everything. He died, Zaitsev. Psychologically died. What's sitting in the cell is no longer a person. It's a shell. But he was a criminal. Yes, but we just committed a worse crime. We killed the person in him. And do you know what's the most terrible thing? We were right. Everything I told him was true. He really was nobody. Just like most of us. A week later, Karelin submitted a report. It contained one sentence. I request to prohibit the use of the third question. The method is effective, but incompatible with the concept of humanity. The report was rejected, but Karelin never used the third question again. And Colonel Zaitsev, who admired the method, shot himself a month later. In the suicide note, it was written, I ask myself the third question and couldn't answer it. Medvedev was tried, served 10 years, was released 7 years early under amnesty, lived another 5 years in a communal apartment on the outskirts of Moscow. He died alone. At the funeral, there were 3 people, a neighbor and 2 employees of the funeral service. But the story of the 3 questions did not end there. Ahead lay the Cold War of intelligence services, where psychological weapons were valued higher than nuclear ones. The 1970s of the 20th century entered the history of special services as the era of psychological wars. If in the 1950s and 1960s intelligence agencies competed in technical means, eavesdropping devices, microcameras, poisons, then in the 1970s,
psychology became the main weapon. The CIA learned of the existence of the three questions method in 1974. The source was Oleg Penkovsky, a former GRU colonel recruited by the Americans back in the 1960s. Before his arrest, he managed to pass a microfilm to the West with part of the manual. The document was incomplete, only general principles without the specific formulations of the questions.
But even that was enough to sound the alarm in Langley. In January 1975, CIA Director William Colby created a special psycho group. The task was to develop countermeasures against the Soviet method and create their own analog. The group was headed by Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, the man behind the MK-Ultra program, the secret experiments on human consciousness. The Americans approached the problem with their characteristic scope. The psycho budget was $15 million a year. They brought in the country's best psychologists, neurobiologists, hypnosis specialists, but most importantly, they began hunting for Soviet defectors familiar with the method. In August 1977, the Americans got lucky. Viktor Sheyamov, an employee of the KGB's 8th Chief Directorate, responsible for encrypted communications, approached the U.S. Embassy in Vienna. Sheyamov did not know the details of the three questions method, but he knew something else: the names of those who applied it. Operation Cardinal began in October. The plan was audacious: infiltrate a double agent into the KGB's Psychological Methods of Influence department itself. They found a candidate quickly: Dmitry Polyakov, a young psychologist working at the Institute of Psychology of the Academy of Sciences. Talented, ambitious, resentful of the system after his dissertation was rejected for political reasons. Recruitment followed the classic scheme: a scientific conference in Prague, a chance meeting with an American colleague, an offer of collaboration on research, gradual involvement. By the spring of 1978, Polyakov was ready, but the KGB was not asleep. By that time, Karelin was already a lieutenant general, head of the 2nd Chief Directorate, and sensed that the Americans were preparing something. Too many oddities in the behavior of Western intelligence services, too much interest in Soviet psychologists at international conferences. In May 1978, Karelin held a meeting of a narrow circle.
"Comrades," he began, "I have reason to believe that the enemy is preparing an operation against our main advantage, the psychological methods of influence." Stepanov, now also a lieutenant general and Karelin's deputy, nodded. "I feel it too, Victor. My people in Washington report. A new department has been created in the CIA. What they're doing is unknown, but the budget is huge. Preventive measures are needed," said Colonel Volkov, head of counterintelligence. "Strengthen employee checks, restrict access to manuals." "That's not enough," Karelin objected. "If they are really hunting for the method, they will stop at nothing. We need a trap." "What kind of trap?" Stepanov asked. "We'll give them what they're looking for, but not the real method, and distorted version of it. Let them think they've uncovered our secret." Operation Reverse Mirror was developed in 2 weeks. The essence was to create a fake version of the three questions method that would look plausible but wouldn't work. Moreover, applying this version should have the opposite effect, strengthening the interrogated person's psychological defenses. The disinformation carrier was chosen as Major Kuznetsov, an employee of the department who had come under suspicion of connections with dissidents. There was no evidence, but doubts remained. Karelin decided to use the situation. They planted a fake manual on Kuznetsov. The document looked genuine. The same seals, the same secrecy stamp, even the paper artificially aged. But the questions were altered. Instead of precise psychological strikes, blurry formulations. Instead of a sequence that breaks defenses, a chaotic set of topics. In June 1978, Kuznetsov defected to the West. As planned, he took the manual with him. The CIA rejoiced. Finally, that very secret document was in their hands. But Karelin underestimated the Americans. Dr. Gottlieb, studying the received document, sensed a catch.
The victory had come too easily, the formulations too obvious.
He ordered the information to be verified through other sources. And that's when Dmitry Polyakov entered the game. By the fall of 1978, he managed to get a job at the Serbsky Institute of Forensic Psychiatry, from where there was a direct path into the KGB system. He was noticed, his talent appreciated, and collaboration offered. In December, Polyakov completed the first stage of training at the KGB school. They didn't trust him with secrets, but he was smart and observant. From scraps of phrases, from instructors' reactions, from the structure of training tasks, he began to reconstruct the true picture of the method. On February 23, 1979, Soviet Army Day, Polyakov transmitted the first real report to the Americans. It contained only a few paragraphs, but they overturned the CIA's understanding of Soviet interrogation methods. The method is not based on specific questions, Polyakov wrote, but on creating a special psychological state. The 3 levels of influence correspond to 3 levels of psychological defense. The first, awakening childhood traumas. The second, creating an insoluble moral conflict. The third, destroying self-identity. Questions are selected individually based on a deep study of the object's personality. Gottlieb realized they were on the right track, but there was little information. Specific examples were needed, transcripts of interrogations, exact formulations. And Polyakov began the hunt for this information. Meanwhile, Karelin sensed something was wrong. The Americans reacted too calmly to Kuznetsov's disinformation, too few attempts to apply the obtained knowledge, as if they knew it was a fake. In March 1979, Karelin conducted a secret check of everyone who had access to information about the method. 120 people went through lie detectors, psychological tests, cross-interrogations. 119 were clean. The 120th was Dmitry Polyakov. The arrest was planned carefully. They couldn't spook him, couldn't let the Americans know their agent was exposed. Karelin decided to play the long game. On April 8, Polyakov was called to Karelin's office, officially for consultation on a complex case, unofficially for the last conversation. Dmitry Borisovich, Karelin began, I have a special assignment for you. Polyakov tensed but didn't show it. I'm listening, Comrade General. Do you know about the 3 questions method? I've heard of it, but I don't know the details. I want you to learn them. Moreover, I want you to become a specialist in this method, one of the few who masters it perfectly. Polyakov couldn't believe his ears. Was this such luck? This is a great honor, Comrade General, but why me? You have a suitable psychological profile. High intelligence, emotional stability, ability to empathize, but there is one condition. What is it? You must pass a check, a special check. Do you agree? Polyakov understood that refusal would look suspicious. Of course, Comrade General. Excellent. Then let's start right now. Karelin stood up, walked to the window, was silent for a long time, then, without turning around, asked, Dmitry Borisovich, tell me about your childhood, about that day when you first betrayed a person who trusted you. Polyakov felt a chill. He recognized the formulation. This was the first question from the triad, the real one, not from the fake manual. Karelin was applying the method against him. I don't understand the question. Polyakov tried to buy time. You understand, Dmitry Borisovich. You understand perfectly. You were 12 years old, Pioneer Camp Artek. Your friend Sasha Melnikov stole a can of condensed milk from the dining hall. You knew, but kept silent. And when they started looking for the culprit, what did you do, Dmitry? Polyakov realized he was in a trap. Karelin knew everything about him. But how? Where did this information about the long-ago incident in Artek come from? I said that I saw Sasha leaving the dining hall, Polyakov said quietly. And what happened next? Sasha was punished, expelled from the camp. His parents took him home. But it's not about the punishment, right? It's about what happened after. Polyakov was silent. Karelin turned to him. Sasha found out that it was you who betrayed him and forgave you.
He came to your home in Moscow, said he holds no grudge, understands you were scared, that you remain friends. And you? I couldn't look him in the eye. Polyakov's voice trembled. I avoided him, moved to another district, entered another school. I couldn't forgive myself the betrayal. I couldn't forgive that he forgave me. That's why you became a psychologist, to understand the nature of betrayal. Yes. And that's why you agreed to work for the Americans, to prove to yourself that you are capable of loyalty. Even to strangers, even to enemies. But loyalty. Polyakov raised his eyes to Karelin. There was fear and at the same time relief in them. You know everything. Everything, Dmitry Borisovich. I know from the moment you were recruited in Prague. We followed your every step. Why? Why didn't you arrest me right away? Because you were useful. Through you, we transmitted to the Americans the information we wanted to transmit. But now the game is over. Polyakov stood up. I'm ready for arrest. Sit down. Karelin returned to the table. I have a proposal for you. You will continue to work for the Americans, but now, according to our scenario, you will transmit what we say, in exchange for life and freedom. And if I refuse, then the second question, and the third. You studied the method, you know what will happen next. Polyakov understood. After the second question, he would tell everything. After the third, he would cease to be himself. I have conditions, he said. I will work for you, but not against America.
Only disinformation, no real harm. Karelin smirked. You are not in a position to set conditions, but I agree. We don't need war, Dmitry Borisovich. We need balance. And for balance, each side needs to think that they know the other's secrets. Thus began Operation Double Mirror. Polyakov became a triple agent. He worked for the Americans, who thought he was working for them, while he worked for the KGB, which used him to transmit controlled information. Through Polyakov, the Americans received an improved version of the 3 questions method. Not quite fake, but not completely real either. Truthful enough to work sometimes, but not precise enough to be truly effective. The CIA spent millions of dollars developing countermeasures against the half-truthful version of the method. They created psychological training programs for agents, developed resistance techniques, even tried to create pharmacological blockers. All this was useless against the real method, but Karelin was in no hurry to demonstrate that. The Cold War of intelligence services continued in the shadows, invisible to the world but determining its fate. In 1981, an incident occurred that nearly destroyed the entire House of Cards. But about that in the next chapter. While the Soviet and American intelligence services played cat and mouse, a new player was rising in the East, the People's Republic of China, which had long been in the shadow of the 2 superpowers, began creating its own school of psychological methods of influence. It all started in 1969, during the border conflict on Damansky Island. On March 2nd, Chinese border guards captured Junior Lieutenant Ivan Strelnikov as a prisoner. The 23-year-old border troops officer knew the location of all outposts in the sector, the communication system, and the patrol schedules. The Chinese interrogated Strelnikov using their own methods.
A combination of physical impact and psychological pressure, based on ancient Taoist practices of breaking the will. But the young officer held firm. 2 weeks of torture yielded no results. And then Wang Shopin entered the fray, a psychologist who had received his education in Moscow in the 1950s, when the USSR and China were still allies. Wang was one of the few Chinese who had heard of Soviet psychological methods, though he didn't know the details. On March 15th, Wang entered Strelnikov's cell. Instead of the usual interrogation, he began with something unexpected. "Comrade Lieutenant," he said in Russian, "tell me about your mother." Strelnikov, prepared for torture, was taken aback by such a question. "What does my mother have to do with this?" "She died when you were 7 years old, from tuberculosis." Strelnikov couldn't understand how the Chinese man knew this. In reality, Wang had simply guessed. Tuberculosis was a common cause of death in post-war USSR. "Yes, she died. So what? Tell me about her last day. What did she say to you?"
And Strelnikov, not understanding why himself, began to tell about the hospital, the smell of medicines, how his mother asked him to be strong, to take care of his younger sister. Wang listened, nodded, asked clarifying questions. He didn't know the exact technique of the first question, but intuitively he was probing the sore spots. "And what happened to your sister?" Wang asked. "She died a year later, also from tuberculosis. And you felt guilty, because your mother asked you to take care of her." Strelnikov cried for the first time in 2 weeks of captivity. Wang realized he was on the right track. For the next 4 hours, the Chinese psychologist methodically dismantled Strelnikov's psychological defenses. Not according to the Soviet method, he didn't know it, but according to his own, based on the Confucian understanding of duty and guilt. By evening, Strelnikov had told everything, but something unexpected happened.
The information turned out to be useless. Over the 2 weeks while the interrogations were ongoing, the Soviet command had changed the entire border defense system. Passwords were changed, outposts relocated, patrol schedules revised. But Wang Sopin made another discovery. He understood the principle. Impact on deep psychological traumas gives a greater effect than physical violence. After the Demansky conflict, Wang received an assignment from China's Ministry of State Security to create their own version of psychological interrogation methods. The country's best specialists were brought in, including masters of traditional medicine and experts in ancient psychotechniques. By 1975, the Chinese had created their own method. San, 3 questions. But these were not the same 3 questions used by the KGB. The Chinese approach was based on a different cultural matrix. The first question concerned mianzi, social status and reputation, critically important to the Chinese mentality. The second touched on the concept of filial piety, shao, toward ancestors and elders. The third destroyed the notion of fate, of the predetermination of one's life path. In 1978, the Chinese decided to test their method in practice, and the opportunity presented itself. In August of that year, Nikolai Sherbakov, a Soviet trade representative employee, actually a GRU resident, was arrested in Beijing. The arrest occurred under strange circumstances. The Chinese seemed to know exactly where and when to take him. Sherbakov had undergone full training in counter-interrogation techniques, including familiarity with the 3 questions method. He was prepared for the Soviet version of psychological influence. But the Chinese applied their own variant. The interrogation was conducted by Colonel Li Wenjun, a student of Wang Xiaopin who had perfected his teacher's method. "Mr. Sherbakov," Li began in excellent Russian, "you know that your father was a white officer." Sherbakov tensed.
This was a family secret, carefully hidden for decades. My father died in the Civil War, fighting for Soviet power. Yes, he died, but first he fought against it in Denikin's army, then switched to the Reds. Doesn't it torment you whether this switch was sincere or he was just saving his life? This has no relation to the case. It does, Mr. Sherbakov. You've spent your whole life proving loyalty to the system that your father betrayed. You became a spy not out of patriotism, but out of fear. Fear that the truth about your origins would surface. Fear of repeating your father's fate. The traitor. Sherbakov was silent, but Li saw he had hit the mark. In Chinese tradition, the colonel continued, the sins of the fathers fall on the children to the 7th generation. You carry the karma of betrayal on your shoulders, and no matter how hard you try, you cannot rid yourself of it. Your fate is predetermined. This was a blow to the most painful spot. Sherbakov had indeed spent his entire life struggling with his father's shadow, but he held firm. I am a Soviet officer. I swore an oath to my homeland. To which homeland? Li leaned closer. The one your father betrayed, or the one that hides the truth about millions like him? You serve a lie, Mr. Sherbakov, and you know it.
The interrogation lasted 4 hours. Lee methodically dismantled Sherbakov's identity, using concepts of guilt, duty, and predetermination. But the Soviet spy held out. And then Lee applied something that wasn't in the Chinese method, but that he had gleaned from scraps of information about the Soviet one. He posed a question of choice. Mr. Sherbakov, I have a proposal. We know about your daughter in Moscow. 14 years old, straight-A student, dreams of becoming a doctor. If you cooperate, we guarantee that information about your arrest won't reach Moscow. Officially, you died in a car accident. Your daughter will receive a pension, be able to study, live a normal life.
If you refuse, the whole world will learn about the traitor Sherbakov and his White Guard grandfather. What will the daughter of an enemy of the people choose? This was a violation of all rules. The Chinese were bluffing. They couldn't control the information in the USSR, but Sherbakov didn't know that. In his mind, duty and fatherly love were struggling. Give me time to think, he croaked. Until morning. That night, Sherbakov didn't sleep. He understood that the Chinese might be lying, but they might not be. The risk was too great. In the morning, he agreed to talk. But something happened that no one expected. Sherbakov began to tell the truth. But not the truth the Chinese were expecting. He told about corruption in Soviet intelligence, about the clan struggles in the KGB and GRU, about how many secrets had long ceased to be secrets. You want to know our plans in China? Sherbakov said. There are none. We just pretend to be active, write reports that no one reads, recruit agents who know nothing. It's all theater, you understand, a performance for the bosses. Lee was puzzled. This was the truth, he felt, but useless truth. We need the names of your agents in China. There are none. That is, there are people listed as agents, but they just take money and tell what is already known. We know they work for you. You know that we know. Everyone knows everything, but pretends it's a secret. For 4 days, Sherbakov told the truth about bureaucracy, about padding, about how intelligence had turned into an imitation of activity. The Chinese received a mass of information, but couldn't figure out what to do with it. On the 5th day, something unforeseen happened. An unfamiliar man came into Sherbakov's cell. He introduced himself simply as Comrade Jian. In fact, it was Jian Jin Fu, head of the 2nd Directorate of the Ministry of State Security, the Chinese counterpart to Karelin.
Mr. Sherbakov, Jian said, I have read all your testimonies, and I have one question. Why are you lying to us? I'm telling the truth. No, you are telling half-truths, the worst kind of lie. Yes, there is corruption and bureaucracy in your intelligence, but there is also real work. Yes, many agents are fiction, but there are real ones. You are trying to hide grains of truth in a heap of truthful lies. Sherbakov smirked. And you are perceptive, Comrade Jian. I know Russians. You are masters not of direct lies, but of distorting perspective. But I have a way to get to the truth. Jian made a sign. A tape recorder was brought into the cell. On the tape was the voice of Sherbakov's daughter. Daddy, where are you? Why aren't you calling? Mom said you're on a business trip, but I feel something happened. Daddy, please come back. The recording was made through wiretapping in the Moscow apartment. Sherbakov paled. You promised. We promised not to spread information about your arrest, and we're not spreading it, but your daughter is worried. She asks about you every day. How long do you think she'll endure the uncertainty? A week? A month? And then she'll start looking for the truth herself? This was a blow below the belt, but effective. Sherbakov broke. For the next 2 days, he told the real truth. Names, dead drops, codes. But the Chinese made a fatal mistake. They overlooked one thing. Soviet intelligence knew about Sherbakov's capture from the first day, and all the data he could reveal had already been changed. Moreover, Karelin used this situation for grand disinformation.
Through Sherbakov, the Chinese were fed false information about Soviet plans in the Far East. The information looked so plausible that Beijing redeployed 3 divisions to the border. A month later, Sherbakov was exchanged for a Chinese spy arrested in Khabarovsk. Returning to Moscow, Nikolai Vasilievich resigned, officially due to health reasons.
In reality, he couldn't forgive himself for talking. Karelin met with him personally.
Nikolai Vasilievich, you are a hero. You withstood the Chinese method and transmitted disinformation.
I broke, Comrade General. I told the truth.
The truth we wanted them to learn. Everything was under control, but you didn't know that. You really betrayed.
Karelin was silent for a moment, then said, "You know, what's the difference between our method and the Chinese one? We break a person to get to the truth. They break the truth to get to the person. You remained a person, Nikolai Vasilievich. That's the main thing."
Sherbakov lived another 20 years. Quietly, unnoticed, he taught Chinese at the institute, never spoke about what happened in Beijing. And the Chinese, after this incident, revised their method. They understood that psychological weapons cut both ways. You can break a person, but you can't be sure you'll get the truth. The story of the 3 questions method was coming to an end. Ahead lay 1985, and that very interrogation in office number 13, with which our tale began.